Thank you so much for the invitation and overall for this first very interesting discussion in the first part of the session. So I'm gonna share my screen with the presentation I'm gonna give today. That is building on what we discussed in the first part of this section, working on with some data and some information from the Italian context. This project is called, this paper is called Goals and Gaps, Educational Careers of Immigrant Children. And it's co-authored with Eliana La Ferrara and Paolo Pinotti. So I feel like I don't need to spend much time on the motivation, given all that we have seen up to this point. But even in the Italian, more broadly, track choice is a very crucial career decision for students that has very long and deep implication for the labor market outcomes of individuals. Because when you get tracked at a very early age, these will create substantially, they will affect the human capital accumulation and the opportunities that someone has in the labor market. Now, tracking is potentially detrimental for disadvantaged groups, for people from lower socioeconomic status, because of different potential challenges. So the first one is information gaps. So children from a disadvantaged background may have less information on the returns to different high school tracks and the implication of the different tracks. The second key component, and is building on some work that has been presented before, linked to some work presented before, is thinking about the aspiration trap. So related to the fact that you may have too low aspiration, and this may generate substantially low SES student to be induced into lower tracks because they don't have, for example, the engineering, the parents with an engineering background that are willing to support them, or that they look up to them and want to achieve at least the same level of education. Sorry, I see a message that you don't see my shares. Can you see my screen, right? Okay, perfect. Now I feel should be all set. And finally, the third potential channel is coming from a potential a frustration from too high aspiration. If low SES students do not have enough support, but they attend a too high track, they may get frustrated and may decide to drop out instead of completely education. So the issue I'm gonna tackle today will be specifically thinking about a specific group of disadvantaged students, that is first and second generation immigrants in the Italian context, where immigration is a pretty recent phenomenon. Today I will first show you a couple of pictures in documenting educational segregation in terms of the high school track choice of students. And I will then move on in discussing one of the projects is a randomized controlled trial where we offered a career counseling intervention called Equal Opportunities for Immigrant Students, aimed at helping students that are top achievers, so students in the top of the ability distribution, and helping them to make a decision congruent with their actual academic potential. And finally, I'm going to show you some mechanism for which this EOP program was actually working, thinking about both a cognitive aspect, but also non-cognitive dimension, in particular the role of aspiration, but also the teacher track recommendation. A little bit of the context. So the Italian context is not too different from the French one. So we have a different tracking system with academically oriented high school that are mainly preparing students for college. We have an intermediate track that is called technical high school that is preparing students both potentially for college. So if they go to college, they tend to go to engineering or economics, given that this is the focus of the technical track, or like to white-collar jobs. And finally, the vocational track that is mainly for blue-collar jobs, but tend to have like a very low quality in terms of like the preparation that it gives to the students. So it's not really comparable, for example, to the German system, where the vocational track tend to be like extremely high quality and well organized, but it tend to be like slightly on the lower side of like quality and trying to keep like a student in school a little bit longer without providing necessarily like enough like support for their careers, with like a very high unemployment rates after the vocational track. And in Italian context, we have standardized test scores that are done from all the students in different points in time. In grade 6, 8, and 10 will be what we're going to use for this specific project. So here, like one first fact that documents educational segregation of immigrant children. On the left graph, you see the information for male students, on the right graph for female students. And here I'm using colors with like the green color for natives and the red for like immigrants, including both first and second generation immigrants. In this graph, you see like in the x-axis, the quantile of the standardized test score at the beginning of middle school in grade 6. With like the highest quantile, meaning that they are the student in the top 20% of the ability distribution as measured by the standardized test score. In the y-axis, you see the probability of enrolling in a high track, which I will consider for this presentation, either an academic track or a technical track. So one of the two top tier tracks. And here you see that systematically, for each level of ability, immigrant students tend to have like a lower probability of enrolling in the high track. And this is very clear for like boys, that is happening throughout the distribution. Well, for girls, what is very interesting and what was initially surprising for us when we started like to analyze the data for this project is that you see this clear gap for girls that are in the middle and bottom of the ability distribution, but this gap is actually closed in the top of the ability distribution, with girls that are taking like decision choices that are very close to natives with the same ability. And this is actually has been like shown more recently in other contexts, including like the US, for example, showing that boys from a disadvantaged background are the ones suffering the most in terms of like their educational choices. With like this general idea building also on the sociology literature that boys are more allowed like to slack off, and this has implication for their like perseverance in terms of like their educational careers. While girls like are more supposed to like be well on track, be the one that are diligent and do all their homework, but this may have like very positive implication, especially for those coming from a disadvantaged background that have less like family necessarily family support in terms of like achieving their educational goals. Now here you see a very similar picture, but like here the outcome is not the track choice, but is the school failure rate. And here you see that systematically for boys with the same ability compared to natives, if they are from an immigrant background, they are systematically more likely to fail, and so being retained 1 year in school compared to native boys with the same standardized test score. These are the two important outcomes that I'm going to show you as a result of the experiment. So this is why I wanted to give you some context and just like make sure that we understand a little bit the potential problem with boys being like induced like to attend like lower level high school tracks, but also failing like a high school, failing like middle school more, even with the same like standardized test score. Now, let me give you a little bit more information about this specific program that we tested in the Italian context. This was like a collaboration with the Ministry of Education and financed by Free Bank Foundation, and was targeting to high-performing students from a low socioeconomic, coming from a low-income countries. Which meant like a income level, so their country of origin was like a lower income compared to the Italian context. The goal of the program was to align their high school track choice with their actual academic potential, without necessarily pushing them to the best, to the academic track, but just like understanding what was their goal and making sure that their track choice was aligned with that. We selected among 145 schools with at least like 20 immigrant students in 5 provinces like in the north. We selected randomly 70 schools that received this program, while like 75 schools were in the control group. So proceeded like with the usual like career counseling, the standard process like done by all schools, with like the career counseling being like taken care by like the parents and with like some collaboration from the teachers in the schools. The students for this project were selected as like the 10 immigrant children in these schools with the highest standardized test score in grade 6. We had like almost like 80% of the students that were selected to participate in the program that actually like attending the whole intervention. The intervention included 2 sets of activities. So the first one was a career choice consultancy that was a psychological support based on the social cognitive career theory that included like some group meetings between the 10 students in the school that were participating in this program, some individual meetings with like a psychologist, and like some meetings with like the parents, and also one meeting with the teacher. So the overall was a very like holistic, like broad approach, thinking about the whole like community that was surrounding the decision choice of the student in terms of like their high school track. The second component was cognitive academic language proficiency course that was targeted actually to students that were below a certain level of test score. So this will be like very important because the design of our intervention will allow us both to compare students that were the top 10 students in treated schools with the top 10 students in the control schools, but also on the other hand to compare students around this discontinuity cutoff to understand the role of the career choice consultancy, this psychological support, compared to this sort of like a tutoring program that was, but still like targeted at these like high achieving like students that were already in the top of the ability distribution. And we use several data sources for this program, including like administrative data from the Ministry of Education, the National Evaluation Center with standardized test score, but also first-hand data with like a questionnaire on psychological trait collected both from treated and controlled students. So this is just like an overview of like how our treated and controlled students are compared to the average immigrant and the average like native students. As you see, the blue line shows that these students are doing much better compared to the average immigrants. They are selected to be the top achievers in their schools among the immigrants in the schools, and they are doing like on average like very close to like the average native, average like top native in terms of like their distribution. So here are the results. I will show you like the results on our 2 key outcomes with like some very simple graphs. So in each of these graphs, you're going to show you the mean of the outcomes. So in this case, the probability of choosing the high track for the students in the control group. So students that were high achievers in those schools that were selected to not participate in our program. And so this is the blue bar. So the red bar is going to show you the impact for those students that were the top achievers in treated schools, so selected to participate in our program. Well, like the white bar is going to show you the comparable natives. So we're going to pick some natives with the same ability at baseline to have like just like a standards of like how natives are behaving in terms of like their track choice. So this will not be causal, but it will just give you like a sense of like how much we're closing the gaps compared to natives. So what you see here in the left graph for males, you see that students in the control group have a probability of attending like a high track, even if they are in the top of the ability distribution that is around 67 percentage point. And while natives with the same ability to start with in middle school, they have a probability of attending this high school that is almost 12 percentage point higher. So this is around higher than the 77 percentage points. And so what we find is that actually our intervention was extremely useful for boys, closing all the gaps in terms of the probability of choosing the high track between the immigrants in the control group and the natives. So this improved their probability of choosing the high track of 13.5% compared to students in the control group. What happened to girls? Well, as you see here, girls in the control group had that very similar probability compared to native girls of choosing the high track. And our intervention had actually no effect. So the students in the treatment group were still choosing the high track with the same share as a student in the control group. So what do we find in terms of a greater retention? Well, here you see, even if these students were top achiever in their school, they still have a higher than 8 percentage point, 8% probability in the control group of failing a school year and being retained, so losing 1 year, repeating the same grade. So this probability for natives with similar ability is 4%, less than half compared to immigrants in our control schools. And what we find is that, again, with this intervention, we were closing the whole gap, reducing the probability of failing of almost 50%, 43.5% for students in the treatment group compared to students in the control group. Well, there was actually no effect for females students that had already a very low probability of failing a school year. Now, our design allows us to understand something more. We can disentangle the role of the career, the tutoring part for these high achieving students compared to the career counseling part. And we're going to use a different empirical method that is called the regression discontinuity design, comparing students in the treatment group for those just above and those just below this threshold that was set to assign them to the tutoring intervention or not. What you see here in the top panel is that the number of career counseling meetings in the top right panel was very similar for those that were right above or right below this threshold. However, those that were right above the threshold, they had less tutoring support compared to those that were below this threshold that were receiving way more tutoring meeting. However, at this margin, and this is what you see in the bottom tab panel, both for the choice of the high track and the greater retention, you see there is no impact. So they are doing equally well. These students were doing already extremely well. So this was a waste of resources in trying to invest in doing a sort of a tutoring and additional potential remedial education for these students. They didn't need these tutoring intervention, but they did benefit a lot, especially boys, from these from the intervention coming in terms of psychological support and understanding better their career choice. Now, in the last few minutes, I'm gonna give you a little bit of background also on potential channels of what was going on in terms of our intervention, in terms of channels driving the results. So we first find very positive effect in terms of their performance in standardized test score, especially for boys. As you see here, boys in the control group, even if they were starting with the same test score compared to the comparable natives, they are lagging behind in the immigrant control group if they don't get any additional support. This could be because they don't get enough family support, they don't get have enough other resources. However, this type of intervention, even if it was providing mainly career counseling, it was helping them keep up the motivation and work hard on their standardized test score, performing equally well compared to natives. This is very clear in math, but it's also happening in Italian, where for girls, we do not have any treatment effect on the academic in terms of standardized test score. The other key aspect I wanted to share was in terms of like a track recommendation. Here you see these like a striking gap. So these are boys that were very similar to compared to comparable natives, and natives get recommended almost 60% to the high track. Well, like for immigrants, the probability of being recommended to the high track is almost half, like it's like lower than 40 percentage points in the control group. But students that receive our intervention close this gap, so their teachers recommend them like much more to the high level track. For girls, you see that there is a little bit of gap between the natives and the immigrant girls, but it's actually very small. It's like less than 10 percentage point, and still like our intervention was able like to close this gap, but it was like not very large to start with. And finally, here you see a bunch of dimensions, like in terms of like aspiration and perception of barriers, that shows like a overall like a positive improvement in the treatment group, so the red line compared to the control group, the blue line. And if we put all of these in a decomposition exercise to understand which channel was driving the effect, actually we do find that the own academic motivation of students, so this aspiration channel, and the teacher track recommendation were the two driving channels that had the strongest impact in affecting the high school track choice for boys in our program. So given that I'm running out of time, let me conclude here and like tell you, just like summarizing like the main results. So what we do find is that this intervention was extremely effective in reducing educational segregation for boys that are those that suffer the most if they are from an immigrant background and they come, but they are still able like to get at the top of the ability distribution. They still suffer and they are pushed into the lower tracks, but this program was able to close this gap, was able to also reduce their failure rate. And the main channels that were driving this effect were the academic motivation, so the aspiration of the student that improved a lot, especially for boys, and the teacher track recommendation that was like strongly affected by our intervention because of like this systemic view of working with the entire community that was like helping to provide this track recommendation to the students. Some results I didn't have time to cover, but we also do find very positive effect on the immigrant classmate of the treated students, suggesting that these type of intervention are very cost effective, not only because they affect like the top achievers, but have like overall a positive spillover for the entire immigrant community. Thank you so much for the time for this presentation, and I look forward to your questions.